Hello, and welcome to Health and Safety Month at WorkSafe. Thank you for being part of today's webinar on work-related gendered violence, including sexual harassment. My name is Natalie Wellard, and I am a Manager of Policy and Legislation here at WorkSafe. I will be your host for today. I am also joined by two of WorkSafe's experts in this field, Taryn Calloway, Senior Psychological Health and Safety Specialist.
Good morning, thank you.
And Jodie Peskett, Service Model Specialist, Strategic Delivery.
Hi, Nat.
Thank you both for joining us today. In this morning's session, we'll learn about work-related gendered violence, including sexual harassment, which are OH&S issues and are unacceptable and preventable in workplaces. Before I get into the detail, I wanted to let you know that some of our content may be sensitive and may be a trigger for some of you. If that happens, please feel free to walk away and give WorkSafe Advisory Line a call, who can provide you with some really helpful resources. Today, we're going to unpack some of the key issues related to gendered violence and provide practical guidance and advice about how to reduce workplace harm arising from these hazards, including the implementation of effective controls. And we'll discuss the duty employers have to provide a workplace that is safe and free from work-related gendered violence. Specifically, we will explore the following key topics with our speakers. Work-related gendered violence is an OH&S issue, and it's a hazard that must be prevented from occurring in the working environment. Or if it is occurring, it must be eliminated as far as reasonably practicable. Controlling work-related gendered violence cannot be done in isolation. For example, removing one perpetrator of the behaviour is rarely enough to eliminate gendered violence from workplaces. Systems of work, job design, and workplace cultural expectations must be included in any plan to assess risk, prevent, and control work-related gendered violence. And finally, and most importantly, work-related gendered violence is not just part of the job. Employers have a positive duty to prevent it. I'm going to start with you, Jodie. Let's go back to basics. What is gendered violence in the context of work-related gendered violence?
Thanks, Nat. So WorkSafe, we have a definition of gendered violence, which comes from our WorkSafe guidance, and we define work-related gendered violence as any behaviour that is directed at any person that affects a person because of their sex, gender, or sexual orientation, or because they do not adhere to socially prescribed gender roles, and that this creates a risk to health and safety. So within this definition of gendered violence, it includes violence targeted directly at someone, specifically because they're a woman, they identify as LGBTIQA+, so that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, or asexual, or because they don't follow socially prescribed gender roles and gender stereotypes. So what that piece there means is that if you if you are, not a typical woman or typical man, maybe you work in a non-traditional industry, or you have certain ways of being that don't conform to what society thinks men and women should be like. And I think from this definition, the really important thing to keep in mind as well is that anyone can experience work-related gendered violence and anyone can perpetrate work-related gendered violence. So it pretty much affects everyone.
Thanks, Jodie, for defining that for us. I'm going to stay with you again. People might find the use of the word violence here confusing or confronting, but it's important to understand that violence is not only just physical. So could you explain how the word violence is used in this context?
Yeah, so it's the evolution of the concept of gendered violence. It's evolved similar to family violence. So once upon a time, we considered socially family violence was just physical, but now we've broadened our understanding of family and violence to include psychological, social, and economic violence. It's similar with work-related gendered violence. So it covers a whole spectrum or range of behaviours, everything from comments and gestures, poor taste jokes, right through to sexual assault and rape. Also, it can be experienced indirectly, so you don't have to be the target of the behaviour or action. You can witness it, and that can still impact your health and safety and your well-being at work. So, for example, overhearing a conversation that it is using kind of gendered violence, around jokes or material content that's being discussed, even if it's targeted at someone else, that can impact you. So when we talk about gendered violence, we're talking about a spectrum of behaviours, and we're also looking at how these impact individuals, so how they harm or violate someone.
I'm going to ask you one more question before I'll move on. We often hear work-related gendered violence includes sexual harassment. So how does sexual harassment fit into work-related gendered violence?
Yep, this is a great question and one that comes up a lot. So we have kind of the umbrella term of work-related gendered violence, and sexual harassment is a form of work-related gendered violence. So at WorkSafe, we use the same definition of sexual harassment that you'll find in the Equal Opportunity Act, which states that a person sexually harasses another person if they, one, make an unwelcome sexual advance or an unwelcome request for sexual favours to the other person, or engages in any other unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature in relation to the other person in circumstances in which a reasonable person, having regard to all the circumstances, would have anticipated that the other person would be offended, humiliated, or intimidated. So what that means in short, if we take away the legal language, basically sexual harassment is any sexualized behavior that a reasonable person, so the average person, would perceive as unreasonable and which is unwelcome, hasn't been invited by the person experiencing it. So as I said, it's a form of work-related gendered violence. So you can kind of think of it as a subcategory of that umbrella of work-related gendered violence. And what sits behind both work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment as a form of gendered violence are deep-seated social norms, structures, attitude, and practices that drive and enable these kind of sexual harassment and gendered violence to happen. So the other reason that the two terms sit together is because what drives them are pretty similar stuff that are historically in our society and which also come into work in our workplaces.
Taryn, can you explain what someone who may have experienced work-related gendered violence might experience?
Absolutely. Thanks, Nat. So the impacts of work-related gendered violence, including sexual harassment, can vary for different individuals, but they may experience something like anxiety. So that could be anxiety about dealing with particular individuals or a more general anxiety. They could experience symptoms of depression. They might withdraw from their team or withdraw from their family at home or from with friends. They might also want to avoid going to work, so they might be absent from their workplace. They could also experience thoughts of self-harm or suicide ideation. And then there's the physical impact they might experience as well, which might be things like stomach issues like nausea, or their eating and sleeping habits might be impacted as well. There might be musculoskeletal impacts, and there might be distractions at work, which could lead to physical injuries.
Some pretty significant impacts there for the individual. So now that we know a little bit about the injuries that this can cause, how did you determine work-related gendered violence to be a legally defined OH&S issue or hazard?
Yeah, great question. So we know that work-related gendered violence, including sexual harassment, is a known cause of physical and psychological injuries. Now, where a risk exists of work-related gendered violence, including sexual harassment, which might cause a physical or psychological injury, employers have an obligation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to control that risk so far as reasonably practicable. Now, that obligation is in addition to the obligation of employers under the Equal Opportunity Act.
So do you have a practical example here, Taryn, that you could use to illustrate that point?
Absolutely. So if we could consider maybe a manufacturing company where it might be a male-dominated industry, a female employee might consistently be subjected to gendered violence by her male colleagues. They might make derogatory comments about her abilities. So it might be something like she shouldn't be allowed to drive the forklift because women can't drive. If they belittled her contributions during team meetings and exclude her from important projects and social activities because of her gender. So as a result, she might experience constant stress and anxiety, which affects her job performance and leads to her feeling really unsafe at work. So we know in this instance, if the employer hasn't done their duty to control those risks, they'll have breached Section 21(1), as they've not provided a safe and healthy workplace, as that female employee does not feel safe when she's in that workplace with those colleagues.
Great, thanks, Taryn. So back to you now, Jodie. What are some examples of work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment that might occur in the workplace?
Yeah, great. This is really good to get some practical idea of what this looks like, because it can be a pretty theoretical and relatively new concept. So some common examples are, unfortunately, sexual assault is one. We're all pretty familiar with what that looks like. Sexually explicit gestures, sexist, gendered, homophobic jokes at work in the lunchroom, maybe the off-color blonde joke or gay joke, which can actually harm people in the workplace. Lack of access to facilities, like example, toilets, change areas that afford dignity and privacy to everyone, regardless of whether you're a man, a woman, or you're transgender or gender diverse. Belittling or shaming people, as Taryn mentioned, for not being the right sort of person or fitting in a workplace. For example, picking on a man for not being tough enough or manly enough in certain workplaces. The converse of that might be picking on a woman because she doesn't conform to, stereotypes about women. So maybe she's too tough, or bossy is a common one, which I think people experience a lot at work. Also, sharing images or talking about content that is unsuitable for work. So we're talking about sexually explicit material like pornography, talking about what you did on the weekend or your exploits. And the thing to remember there is that you don't just have to be mindful of one group of workers in your workplace when thinking about these things. So, like, for example, women, you need to be thinking about all workers in your workplace, because no one wants to see porn at work, basically.
Very true. And it's really good to kind of see it laid out like that, like as a spectrum of behaviours and a spectrum of experiences. So Taryn, turning to employer obligations, how can work-related gendered violence be addressed in a workplace under the OH&S legislation? What should employers and their staff and OH&S reps be aware of here?
It's a great question and really important. So what we know is that with psychosocial hazards, they might feel different to physical hazards because they're a bit more unseen, they're a bit invisible. But we know the process to control those risks is going to be no different to how we would address a physical hazard in the workplace. So it can be useful to use a risk management framework where we will identify what the hazard is, assess the risks associated with that hazard. So is it impacting one person, multiple people, a team? And then looking at the impacts of that hazard as well, looking at the implementation of effective controls, and then reviewing and revising those controls where necessary.
Great, thanks, Taryn. Can you provide a real-life example of what an inspector might be looking for when considering work-related gendered violence? I'm going to throw that question to you, Jodie.
Yeah, so we've got a good example, which happened relatively recently. So there was WorkSafe took a case to the Ballarat Magistrates Court, on the 2nd of August in 2018. So a female nurse at Ballarat Base Hospital was exposed to harmful behaviour in the form of sexualised behaviour while attending a patient with an impaired cognitive condition. So what happened in that case is a WorkSafe inspector attended the hospital and found that following the incident, the health service had failed to update patients' behavioural observations, which records incidents of physical and verbal aggression, agitation, or resisting care. So they'd failed to provide workers put a control in place to provide workers with a safe work environment, basically, because there was nothing in place there. And this patient was known to have these behaviours. So this exposed workers to potential future incidents of this sexualised behaviour. So that's one example of the kind of things that inspectors would be looking for. So documentation around controls that have been put in place. Also looking at the environment in the workplace. So, how many people, nurses were attending that patient? Was it safe for one to go in by themselves? What was the room set up like? Were there places where a nurse might get cornered or, be vulnerable and not be able to get out the door? Those kinds of things would be things that inspectors would be looking for.
So Taryn, back to you. How might a duty holder identify work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment as a psychosocial hazard in their workplace?
Yeah, so as I touched on earlier, they can absolutely use that risk management framework. So part of that identification process might be looking at the types of information they have access to. So it could be looking at information from human resources. It could be looking at OH&S registers or reports of sexual harassment or gendered violence. Once they've identified that hazard, they would then go through that process to risk assess.
Great. So I'm going to stay with you, Taryn. So speaking of controls, what are some specific controls that a workplace could put in place?
Another really great question. So I tend to break these up into proactive controls and reactive controls. So proactive controls are the more preventative end of things. So we'll be looking at things like altering the way the work is done. So looking at their work design, which might include exploring whether employees are working by themselves or with others. It could be looking at those layout changes, which Jodie touched on earlier as well. So looking at the environmental factors. So it could be things like bathrooms with separate cubicles. We might look at systems that might flag clients or customers with higher risk of gendered violence. And that might include having a code of conduct or policy and procedures which outline what gendered violence, including sexual harassment, are, what employees should do if they experience or witness that behaviour, how the workplace will manage that and what supports are available, training for all employees around what that code of conduct is, that expected standard of behaviour. Might be awareness training, so that might include understanding gender or sexual identity. It could also include some skills-based training, which might include violence prevention, risk assessment, communication skills, those kinds of things.
You also mentioned reactive controls. What are some examples of a reactive control?
Yeah, so these reactive controls come into play after the employee's been exposed to the hazard. So after they've experienced or witnessed gendered violence, including sexual harassment. So it might include a system to report that behaviour. It could include tracking the employee's exposure to gendered violence, including sexual harassment. It would include appropriate ongoing support from supervisors and managers. And it might include some professional support service as well, which might include EAP, or it may include some clinical supervision. And this needs to be for all parties involved. And so that's not just, I guess, those who are the victim of that behaviour, but also those who might witness it. And also some support for the alleged perpetrator in this instance as well.
Great,
we know that, sorry, no.
Sorry, Sharon, you keep going.
The other thing I would say that would be potentially helpful would be a confidential reporting avenue. So where employees can feel like safe to report that behaviour and not be identified in that.
Great. Thanks, Taryn, for those examples. So we've talked a lot about what the issue is and how employers can identify it and put controls in place. So I'm just going to go and have a look at the poll and see what our audience thinks of these questions. So the 3 questions that we asked the audience this morning were, have you experienced or witnessed gendered violence or sexual harassment in your workplace? So we've got the answer of yes, 39%, and no, 61%. The second question was, are you comfortable or confident in identifying gendered violence and sexual harassment at work and how to manage those hazards? 65% of people say yes, and 35% of people say no. So that's a really good result there, that over half of the audience feels comfortable to identify these hazards. And is your employer taking proactive steps in line with their duty to prevent and respond to work-related gendered violence? And another great result for WorkSafe, yes, 88% of people listening today, and no, 12%. So Jodie, are you surprised by these results at all?
Yeah, look, I am a little bit. Maybe I should, I could retire now maybe, because everyone's doing so well. No, they're fabulous results. I am a bit surprised. I think, though, this reflects a shift that we've had recently in this space. So there's been a lot of activity, both in the OH&S space and also in the equal opportunity space, around sexual harassment and work-related gendered violence in Victoria, but in Australia more broadly. So I think that it's becoming more, people are much more aware of it, workers and employers, and I think people are getting a much better understanding of how we can actually prevent and respond better to these incidents and hazards when they occur. So I think it's really fantastic around, and reflects the fact that the conversation has been growing in recent years.
I'll have to admit, I was a little surprised as well. I think it's great that employees are taking that proactive step to control that in the workplace. It's really important, and we know that the duty is there. So it's really great to hear that so many workplaces are addressing it.
Yeah, thanks, Taryn. I think we've got something coming up that might maybe even contribute to some of these results, particularly around the identifying and the feeling comfortable and capable of addressing them. Jody, does WorkSafe have any recent data or insights, say within the last 12 months, that illustrate the significance of what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, we do, and I alluded to it a little earlier. So we have WorkSafe has been running our first ever work-related gendered violence campaign, which went out. People probably saw it. It was across television. I think it was on movie screens. There was ads in papers. Might have even been some advertisement on transport. So that continues to get really strong engagement, and so that through that campaign, we were able to link people with WorkSafe resources which exist on our website, and also through our social channels as well. So the aim of that work-related gendered violence campaign was to increase community awareness around the term and concept of work-related gendered violence, because previously, I think we were all really familiar with sexual harassment and the fact that sexual harassment caused harm and wasn't okay at work. But this idea around work-related gendered violence, we needed to get more familiar with that. Another aim of that campaign was to grow awareness around worker rights and ways to report work-related gendered violence, which, if we look at the poll results, would indicate that that's been relatively effective, if we can take some of that credit. And we also, the other aim of that campaign was to look at, to help employers who've seen the campaign to make sure that they were more likely to respond to incidents of work-related gendered violence in an appropriate, safe way in line with their duties under the Act. So I think, well, like I said, those poll results sort of indicate maybe that we were hitting some of those KPIs there with that campaign. I think it was a really effective campaign, a really strong campaign. And I'd like to actually play a clip of it now for people, for those who haven't seen it. So yeah, have a look and think about it, and tell us what you think in the chat as well.
It can stalk, threaten and stare. It can hurl abuse at you.
Crazy.
Or quietly comment on your sexuality.
That's so gay.
It can brush up against you deliberately or grab you with force. It can follow you anywhere. It targets workers based on their gender or identity. But it can be stopped. Gendered violence comes in many forms. All are OH&S issues. All are unacceptable.
Thanks, Jody. That is a really powerful ad, and I can see why it's been so effective. So you mentioned some other data and recent initiatives. Do you want to explain a little bit about that, Jody?
Yeah, so that campaign was just one piece of the puzzle that we have been working on. As you saw one example of it there. There are two examples of that campaign, actually. There was one targeted at white-collar workplaces and one targeted at blue-collar workplaces, because we know that work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment exists across the spectrum. It's not really concentrated in one area or another. And the other feature of that campaign video is we wanted to get across the message that work-related gendered violence is a set of behaviours and actions rather than a person. So that's why we kind of articulate it in that way, so that people could have that broader understanding and be able to identify the hazard as the action or the behaviour that's being carried out in the workplace. So another piece of the puzzle that we've been working on is we have a work-related gendered violence one-day refresher training for HSRs. Hopefully there's a lot of HSRs watching this webinar. You can jump on the WorkSafe website and get some information about how you can attend that one-day refresher, where you can do a bit more of a deeper dive into this topic. And we also have a new psychological advisory team in our broader advisory team. So that's a team that's been set up that deals with specifically psychosocial hazards or calls, and including work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment. And we've had over 70 complaints come through to that team between June and September. So that's, obviously it's not good that this is happening in workplaces, but it's really good that people are contacting our psychological advisory team to talk about and report these things. So that's really positive from our perspective.
That's great. Thanks, Jody. So we do have a lot of questions coming through on Slido. I've got a couple more questions for our speakers, which I might just quickly get through, and then we're going to get to audience questions. So Taryn, do you have a on-the-ground case study that you could talk us through to illustrate gendered violence in practice?
Sure. So there's an example that we've taken from one of our HSR gendered violence refresher trainings. So we've got an individual who's working for a finance company in a Melbourne office. He really likes his job and the people that he works with, but some of the behaviour of his male colleagues makes him feel uncomfortable. It's not uncommon, sorry, for him to overhear some of his male colleagues talking openly with one of their female members of the office and joking about what they wanted to do with her sexually. Sometimes I'll send internal team emails which contain kinds of sexual explicit jokes in them. Once when a male worker was in a meeting with his team and his colleagues started joking about trading the female colleague as if she was a financial stock, the male colleague felt really embarrassed for the female colleague, but didn't really know what to do with that. So the behaviour had become so commonplace in that workplace that the male colleague felt on edge and tense at work, and sometimes called in sick because he felt he needed a break from that banter.
So what would be some of the work-related gendered violence that comes up in that example, Taryn?
Yeah, great question. So those sexualized comments that were directed at the female colleague, it's also, I guess, the experience of the person who was witnessing those comments and who was uncomfortable by that. And then there's also those examples of those work emails containing that sexualized material.
Thanks so much. So we're going to wrap up our component of this this morning and get to the audience questions. But before we do, I just wanted to get some takeaways from our speakers. Jodie, what would you like your audience takeaway to be from today's session?
I think the key messages is that work-related gendered violence, including sexual harassment, is an OH&S hazard that can cause harm to workers, and that, as Taryn said at the beginning of this session, we can control it. We can look at it like a physical hazard, and we can use risk assessments and our hierarchy of control to prevent these incidents from happening, and that employers have a positive duty to do that. And also that if anyone is experiencing directly or witnessing work-related gendered violence or sexual harassment, that they can either talk to their HSR or contact WorkSafe to see what they can do further.
Great, thanks, Jodie. And Taryn, what would you like your takeaway message to be?
I think it's just really important for us to address the impacts on psychological health, but looking at things like leadership and culture in the workplace as well, and the impact that can have with this type of issue in the workplace.
Great, thank you both. So I'm going to start asking questions from the audience now. I'm just going to go from the top ones. Our audience is able to like the questions. So these are in order of what our audience really want to hear about. So I'm going to ask this one maybe of you, Taryn. Please, could you talk about how female-only or female-dominated workplaces can control for risks of work-related gendered violence?
Okay, it's an interesting question. I'm trying to understand if it would be more gender violence in between co-workers or from the public or the clients that they serve. I guess in that kind of environment, we would be looking at assessing where the risks might come from. So it might be, what kind of work are they doing? Are there going to be specific risks in there that we need to look at? And then I guess implementing those controls, again, our most effective control is going to be adjusting that work design. So are there parts of the role that we might be able to take out that might not be necessary parts of the role to reduce the likelihood of that exposure? But then again, those reactive controls can come in handy as well around making sure those supports are in place.
Great. Thanks, Taryn. And then I guess on the other side, with exclusively male leadership or male-dominated industries, it can be uncomfortable as a woman to call out inappropriate comments. So what's a good way for an employee to be able to do that?
Sorry, was that directed at me or Taryn?
Oh, sorry, Taryn. I was just thinking of the other side of the scenario that we were just talking about.
Sure. I think in those examples, I probably wouldn't treat it too much differently and what kind of controls I'd implement. But I do think, again, like for any workplace, that kind of leadership level and that kind of culture that we create in the workplace is really important to help address these issues. I think if a female worker is feeling uncomfortable to raise those issues in the workplace, it probably speaks a little bit to what culture has been created there. So it might be finding somebody that you are comfortable with in that workplace to raise that with and kind of work through those steps on what that might look like. And And then if there's, I guess, not really a way for you to address that in the workplace, then you could potentially come to somewhere like our advisory line where you can report those behaviours to us. And then WorkSafe could potentially enter the workplace and explore how those risks are being controlled in the workplace.
Thanks, Taryn. So Jodie, a question for you. What are some practical risk control measures that workplaces can implement?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and one that we get a lot, because this is all well and good, but what does it look like in the workplace? The caveat is that every workplace is different and every hazard is different. So like we would say with any workplace and any hazard, it has to be specific to the workplace. But some examples of things that you can do is you can look at, Taryn spoke a little bit earlier about it, break your workplace into the way you would with other hazards into looking at your systems of work. So the way work is done, the way work is designed, and then your work environment and what we often refer to as workplace culture. So in terms of the way work is done. So when you're doing a risk assessment, are you looking at, are people working alone? Is there ways that you could put controls in place so that people aren't working alone? Do you have, is it, you look at around, so for a female dominated industry, we had a question earlier around work-related gender violence in those industries, looking at workloads. So how many patients' cases are you having to do? So you're having to move through quickly, where things like incident reports and things aren't getting filled out, or behavior management plans, etc. So looking at the way we structure work. Another thing is around work environment. So what is the physical workplace like? Is it well lit? Is it, are all spaces in the workplace visible? If you're working with the public, are there things like barriers and things in place? Are there emergency buttons that you can press? Do you have process and protocols around if an incident of work-related gender violence is happening from the public? Is everyone really clear around what needs to happen in those circumstances in order to respond to incidences or prevent further incidents and ensure that everyone's safe? So there are lots of really practical things that you can look at. WorkSafe's work-related gendered violence guidance also has a list of common examples of controls and things that you can put in place, and a bit of a risk assessment tool. That's a good place to start as well.
Some really great examples. Thank you, Jodie. I'm going to stay with you and ask you about a specific kind of situation. So how would an employer appropriately manage and address or look after the wellbeing of staff with an anonymous report? We might not have enough information, perhaps.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And this is the line we have to walk with anonymous reporting, which, like the question that was directed with Terence earlier, anonymous reporting could be one tool that could be really effective. For example, if you're in a male-dominated industry and you don't feel comfortable raising it. However, it can be challenging if you've got anonymous reporting. But it depends how you set up that anonymous reporting. So the person reporting might be anonymous, but the content or description they give of the incident will give you lots of tools and places you can start to look at. So, they'll usually talk about the behavior. They might not name the person that the behavior came from, but they'll talk about the type of behavior, which then you can go and look at and think, okay, do we need to do some refresher training around what's appropriate in the workplace? Do we need to actually go and look at certain areas or departments that maybe this is happening more in? Are there certain spaces in it? Is this often happening in the lunchroom, or are we getting reports where this is happening at after work or outside of work function? So they're work related, but it's not your day-to-day. So looking at things like that. And also you can look at, if you have anonymous reports, you can look at, are there any patterns that are coming through in those anonymous reports? So are you getting similar things come up? And that can give you a real clue as to what you can do in the workplace, and where you might have some risk, where you might need to put some controls in place. In terms of supporting the individual that might be reporting through anonymous channels, that is challenging. But what you should be doing all the time is putting out calls or reminders to your workers, reminding them of supports that are available to anyone experiencing work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment. So having that built into your conversations regularly and your communications with your workers means that you can keep reminding people that support's there, but also not targeting individuals because they want to stay anonymous. Another thing that you can do is to make sure that all your health and safety reps are trained up in work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment. So sending them all to that one-day gendered violence refresher training, because then you'll have a whole lot of HSRs who are going to be really adept at identifying and being able to talk to people who might be experiencing these things, even if people aren't reporting them officially.
Thank you. Thanks, Jodie. That was really practical for people to take away. So Taryn, I'm going to ask this question to you. What is the role of HR in this area? So does the responsibility kind of sit equally with OH&S and HR?
That's a really great question. And this may depend on the workplace and how things are structured in a workplace. HR absolutely play a role in terms of, I guess, those behavioural interventions, I guess, in that way. And they might be involved in the kind of investigation process. But I guess what's important is how they feed into each other. So while OH&S plays a role in terms of the risk assessment and implementing those controls, HR might be part of implementing those controls as well. And again, I guess if they're responsible for the investigation part, it might be feeding some information to our OH&S teams who can then review and revise those controls as is necessary to make sure all our workers are safe.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here that is asking about where we can access more information, I think. So can you please direct us to the source of this information? Jodie, I'm going to go back to you. I think that's referring to some of the things that we've been talking about today. So where would our audience find that information?
Yeah, so if you jump on the WorkSafe website and you put in under hazards, you can do the drop-down box for psychosocial hazards and you'll see work-related gendered violence there. If you don't want to click through all those links, you can just put in the search bar work-related gendered violence or sexual harassment, and that will take you to the landing page, WorkSafe's landing page, where you'll find links to all these documents, including our work-related gendered violence guidance. There's a link to third-party support services for people who are experiencing or know someone who's experiencing this at work. So 1-800-RESPECT, those kind of numbers, but it's all on that website. You can find it really easily by just searching up gendered violence.
Great, thanks. And then I'm going to stay with you, Jodie, because you had a whole list of really practical controls that employers could use. But someone's asked here, what are some controls that aren't admin related? So not a policy or a procedure or training or awareness discussions.
Yeah, that's a really great question and one we get all the time, and something that we're constantly working on here internally, Taryn's team and other people in WorkSafe. We're constantly looking at these. So this is a relatively new hazard. I mean, it's not new, it's been around forever, but it's new in terms of the OH&S space and WorkSafe recognizing it as a hazard. So we're kind of on the journey of looking at what works and what controls don't work or which ones are practical. But looking outside of admin controls, which are, as we know, and I'm assuming this question is from a HSR, so I love it. We know those admin controls are some of our lower controls. So we want to get some of those higher controls. So that's where looking at your work environment. So some of those engineering controls. How's your workplace set up? Like, and that can be even at a school, like where is your photocopier? Is it in a corner? Are there spaces where people can't see? Those kind of things. It's about setting expectations around behaviors in the workplace. So it's about how you recognize and reward what's seen as a successful in the workplace, how you conduct meetings, where you have them, the times of days you have them. Are you excluding certain people from the workplace inadvertently by holding meetings or work functions at times that people can't make? What kind of flexibility are you providing in the workplace in order to allow everyone to participate equally? So there are other controls. A lot of the physical ones look at the work environment, and like I said, as HSRs and other OH&S people out in workplaces are doing this, basically it's a new space. So we're looking at what works and what doesn't work, but you can look at some of the controls as well for other psychosocial hazards that are relevant. So bullying, what are some of the things you do that are outside admin for bullying? Some of those might work with work-related gendered violence or be adjusted slightly. So there's a whole range of stuff, but at this point, it's trial and error. And we need to keep building up collectively our OH&S understanding of what controls work and which ones are less effective.
Great, thanks, Jodie. So I've got a question for you, Taryn. This audience member is saying we can't control people's behaviour. So how are we supposed to stop people from sexually harassing someone or perpetrating gendered violence?
It's a really great question, and absolutely controlling people's behaviour, I guess, is the unknown, and that's where a hazard like gendered violence and sexual harassment challenging to eliminate, I guess, in that way, because we can't control those people's behaviour. But having all of these really good controls in place in that preventative end of things can help us to do that. So again, looking at the culture of the workplace, we want to look at, again, there's really good job design things that Jodie's already mentioned, but it might even be things like how are our management accessible in the workplace? So if we're looking at, say, layout, it could be that management are visible to employees, and I guess having that management visible rather than closed away in an office might make it harder for people to engage in those kinds of behaviours. I think those really good behavioural expectations can help to address that before those things happen. It's a wealth of information in our guidance material, and I think our Workwell toolkit as well, which will address some of these things also.
Thanks, Taryn. We are getting to the end of the webinar today, but I'm going to see if we can get through a few more questions. There are quite a few. If you put your name against the question, we will be able to get back to you separately. Otherwise, if we don't get to your question today, please give our advisory line a call and they might be able to point you in the right direction as well. But I'm going to see if we can get through a little bit more in the next kind of 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to ask this of, let me have a look what the next one is. So Jodie, I'm going to ask this one of you. Would gender violence take place where male affects, hang on. Oh, so this is a question about who can be a perpetrator of gendered violence at work. So, and I think that the question was around male effects and females, gender and sexual orientation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And like I said at the beginning when we were talking about the definition, anyone can perpetrate work-related gendered violence regardless of your gender, identity, sexuality, your position within the workplace, how you're employed as well. So, gendered violence doesn't just come from patients or the community public or colleagues. It can come from people who are coming in and out of your workplace, delivery people, contractors. So everyone can be involved. And your gender doesn't matter. And we know that work-related gendered violence can be perpetrated by anyone. What we want to focus on, I think I've spoken about this a little bit, is the actionable behaviour, which is the hazard that's not okay. So regardless of who's doing it, if that actionable behaviour is making someone feel unsafe, uncomfortable, ashamed, embarrassed because of something about who they are, the person who's experiencing the gendered violence, then it's a hazard and something needs to be done about it. And coming back to the earlier question as well around female-dominated industries, often if we look at male-dominated workplaces, are often in industries that are facing the public, nursing, teaching. So a lot of that work-related gendered violence is coming from outside, and that can come from members of the public of all identities. So I think it's important for us to focus on the behaviour that's having the impact or causing the harm rather than who's perpetrating.
Thanks, Jodie. Taryn, I'm going to ask this question of you. We did speak about HSRs earlier and HSR refresher courses and things. So this is a question around specifically what HSRs can do in their role to prevent work-related gendered violence in their workplaces.
It's a really good question. I think as HSRs, you guys see, I guess, a lot of what's happening in the workplace, and you might be a more comfortable person for a lot of employees to go to rather than, say, management. So you play a really important role there in being able to see what's going on. I would highly recommend HSRs learn around how to do a kind of psychosocial risk assessment in the workplace, which might look at identifying where those hazards are coming from. And we know, I guess, psychosocial hazards don't appear in isolation. So covering across the board what kind of hazards might be appearing and how they might interplay will really help HSRs understand what they can do, and then they can exercise their powers under the Act to be able to help the workplace address those issues if they're not already being addressed.
That's great. I'm going to stay with you, Taryn. I think this is just a policy-related question. So if an employer has an OVA policy, should work-related gendered violence be included in that policy, or should it be a standalone policy?
This is a really good question. And I guess, to be honest, it probably doesn't matter where it sits exactly, as long as the expectations are still set. So gendered violence, there is going to be some overlap with OVA, but there's also, I guess, this separate part to the gendered violence in that kind of sexual harassment nature. But I think with either of those, you can still set that standard of behaviour, and I think that's really important. So I guess essentially we might look at how many policies you have, whether you want to have them in the one or not, as long as it's really clear that this is still something that needs to be considered and addressed.
Thanks, Taryn. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we might have to wrap it up. I'm going to ask Jodie, what other ways are there to identify work-related gendered violence other than looking at existing information? And someone suggested a survey.
Yeah, so surveys are a common one that you can use because they're anonymous. That only works though if you're in a larger workplace. If you're in a smaller workplace, a survey is going to be more challenging in terms of making sure that your answers are confidential. Other ways is you can look at, so incident reports are a good one, but that's already happened. So we don't, we want to be able to do preventive. Surveys are a good one. Floor walks. So HSR is walking the workplace floor and looking at, if you've got, like Taryn said, a psychological risk assessment, just going around and having a look where you're identifying potential risks that might exist for gendered violence. But also in the course of doing that, it makes HSRs more visible. You would develop relationships with people in the workplace. And so, excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. So it means that people, workers may be more comfortable to come to you if they are experiencing these kinds of behaviours. So that's another way of doing it. Also, ensuring if you're a HSR, you can talk about these things. So you can bring them up and put work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment as a standing item on your health and safety committee meeting. You can also hold toolboxes. So a lot of industries have toolboxes at the beginning of the day. You can have toolboxes with other workers on these topics. So there are ways to start talking about it to kind of create a culture, make people feel more comfortable, and make this issue, this hazard, more visible, that you can do that don't rely on incident reports. But I definitely encourage any HSRs to challenge themselves to go and do a floor walk, using our WorkSafe work-related gendered violence guidance to think about what are some of the things in your workplace in the setup that might increase the risk of work-related gendered violence.
Great, thank you so much. So I think that is all we have time for. As I said earlier, if you do have a question in the chat that we haven't got to, please give advisory a call, and they'll be able to either answer the question or direct you to where you can find out the answers. But thank you so much to our fabulous speakers this morning, Jodie and Taryn. I have learned so much, and I really hope that the audience has found this to be an interesting and informative session as well. This webinar will be available online via WorkSafe's website next month, and we will note on the screen shortly a list of helpful contacts that have been mentioned that you might find helpful. And if you have any further questions or requests for information, we recommend that you get in touch. And remember, if there is something you want to discuss urgently when you're back at work, there is the WorkSafe advisory line and the emergency line. So thank you for being part of today's webinar.